And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome the two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning, National Book Award-winning, and New York Times best-selling author, Colson Whitehead, to the stage.
Well, howdy do. Thanks for having me. Nice of you all to come out on a Saturday morning. I read from an iPad because I don't have a lot of upper body strength, so that's how I do it. But yes, I came in yesterday and met some nice folks at the library last night. It was great meeting the young writers this morning, and I'm excited to the other adventures we're going to have in Nashville. One question I get fairly often is where do I get my ideas from? And I get them from everywhere. The Nickel Boys I got from reading a newspaper report about their Dozier School for Boys in Florida. My first book, The Intuitionist, I happened to be hanging out in my apartment, staring off into space, and then Dateline NBC had a news report about the hidden dangers of escalator inspectors. And so they interviewed an escalator inspector, and I thought, oh, that's a weird job. You don't think about it, but someone has to do it. And there's this guy. And in New York City, there was a law that the inspection certificate for elevators have to be inside the cab. And each year, the guy comes and signs his name. You go to work, you go to school. He comes when you're not there. And it's the same signature. And you go to your friend's building, and the same guy has been there. And I thought, oh, elevator inspector, that's sort of similar. What if an elevator inspector had to solve a criminal case? Wouldn't that be a fun idea for a novel, hardy har? I'd written a novel 2 years before that everyone hated, all publishers. So I figured maybe a novel with a plot could be good next time. So detective novels have plots. And so I decided to have this elevator inspector solve a criminal case. And I tried to figure out what skills an elevator inspector would bring to a criminal investigation. And of course, the answer was none. And so my main character had to solve an elevator mystery, and the story came out from there. So I was just at home watching TV. With Zone 1, I got an idea from a dream, which doesn't really happen that often. I was telling some folks last night that from a very young age, I watched inappropriate movies. My parents are very permissive, and we got HBO as soon as it was invented, so that we didn't have to talk to each other. And I remember seeing A Clockwork Orange. I was 7 years old with my parents, and I was like, "Mommy, what's happening to that woman?" And she was like, "It's a comment on society, shh." And I saw Night of the Living Dead very early. It was on PBS, public TV station on Halloween. And if you haven't seen it in a while, it's the zombie apocalypse, sort of prototypical one. And the main character is black, and I hadn't seen a lot of movies with African-American protagonists. And he's being chased by a white mob that wants to rip him limb from limb, which seemed like a metaphor for America even then, when I was younger. I saw Dawn of the Dead, the sequel, a few years later, which was rated X for extreme violence. But as a family, we went out to see it in the movie theater. And since then, I started having zombie dreams, once a month. And sometimes the zombies are fast, sometimes they're slow, sometimes they talk, sometimes I get away, sometimes they get me. And this went on for decades and decades. And it was depending on my sort of psychological weather is how the zombies would appear. And then in 2009, I was going through some changes in my life. My father had passed away. I was about to get divorced. There were some signs, some hints I was about to get divorced, such as getting a divorce lawyer that tipped me that something was going on. But we always, my wife and I, then wife, would always rent out my aunt's place in Sag Harbor, Long Island, and we'd have guests over for July 4th. It's a house that my grandfather built in the 1940s, and the walls are very thin. I like to explain it's a no-sex house when people come over. So like July 4th, we're going to have a barbecue, some fireworks, no sex. And even though I was going through all this stuff that year, I decided to have folks over. And I woke up Saturday morning, I heard my guests laughing and singing downstairs. And I thought, I wish they would leave. I can't really deal with having guests right now. So I went back to sleep, and I had a dream. And in the dream, I couldn't go into the living room because I wasn't sure if they'd swept the zombies out yet. And I woke up, and I thought that's a good idea for a book. When the apocalypse is over, someone has to make sure that there are no leftover zombies. And usually, if you wake up in the middle of the night and have an idea for a book, you write it down blearily, and you wake up in the morning and see your terrible handwriting. It's a bad idea. Usually it's something like, kill my father, make love to my mother. That's not a idea for a novel. Maybe a short story, maybe. It's been done before, I think. So I was very grateful that I got this idea from a dream. Underground Railroad. I was just sitting in my house one day in Brooklyn. It was the spring of 2000, and I came across a reference to the Underground Railroad and remembered how when I was a little kid, those words were so evocative that I thought it was a literal train beneath the earth, which is very impractical. We have a subway in New York that's 7 miles long, and we can barely keep that going. So 3,000 miles of track going all over America is really a difficult enterprise. But I know I was not the only person to have this idea. Once I started going out with the novel, I would meet people, and I remember going to Florida, and I met a woman in her 60s, I think, who came up to me and asked, have there ever been any investigations about the cave-ins? And I was like, sorry? And she said, well, all this miles of track, it must have been a real hard enterprise. There must have been a lot of cave-ins. And I was like, really? So this goes to show you how compelling that idea of an underground railroad is and how shitty our educational system can be sometimes. So it was, 2000. I thought, oh, that's a cool idea. It's a premise. There's not much of a story there. So I added the element that each state that our protagonist goes through is a different state of American possibility, kind of like Gulliver's Travels. It's like Gulliver's Travels, like the Odyssey or Pilgrim's Progress. Each state that our hero goes through is an allegorical test that has to be solved before you can go to the next stage. And it seemed like such a good idea that I knew that if I'd screwed it up, if I did it back then, I would have screwed it up. I didn't think I was very mature enough to write a novel about slavery. I didn't think I was a good enough writer. I thought if I saw the world, had some Hemingway-esque adventures, was more mature, I might bring that to the work. Stabbed a hobo with a penknife while I was riding the rails. I could bring that stuff to the work and make it really sing on the page. So each time I finished a book, I would pull out my notes and ask myself, am I ready to write this book? And the answer is always no. Until, I guess it was 2014, so 14 years had gone by. And I had sold a book to my editor, but I was having some second thoughts about the idea. So I decided to tell my wife about this Underground Railroad idea that I've been carrying around for so many years. As some of you know, sometimes in a marriage you have to make conversation to kill the silences. So I asked her about it, and she said, well, honey, I don't want to say that the book you're working on now about a Brooklyn writer going through a midlife crisis is dumb per se, but his other book sounds really good. So I was like, huh. So I decided to call my agent, who's really great. I've worked with her for 20 years. And she said, well, Colson, both ideas sound good, which was not very helpful. But then she did something she never does, which was email me on a Sunday. And she said, we know, I can't stop thinking about this other idea that you had. So that was 2 votes. Wednesday was shrink day, so I told my shrink. And she just said, what are you, crazy? I mean, we both know you're crazy, but with your issues, yeah, you should totally work on this Underground Railroad idea or whatever. I think it'd be good for you. So that just left my editor, Bill, who I've worked with, for many years. And I called him with some trepidation to tell him that I wanted to, shift gears. And he just said, giddy up, motherfucker, which is old school publishing talk for it. That sounds very compelling and we should pursue it. So I did. And, it worked out okay. I think after 8 books, I had to be reminded that the book that you're scared of, the hard book, is the one that maybe you should be doing. I think fear is good quality control. If you know that you can pull it off, what's the point of doing it? And that fear can keep you honest no matter how well it went next time. It's sort of like what I call the 007 principle. Because James Bond will kill Goldfinger, he'll blow up Spectre, he raked the moon, whatever he did with Octopussy, I don't even know what that was about. But each time there's a new mission, M is like, don't muck it up, Bond. And you always need a little M in your life to keep you in check, even if you do all these, great things. So with the Nickel Boys, like I said, I got the idea from a newspaper report about a reform school for boys. The Florida School for Boys opened in Marianna, Florida on January 1st, 1900. It was New Year's Day, the start of a new century, with all the optimism that entails. The idea behind the reformatory was a good one. How can we rehabilitate young offenders instead of locking them up with adult criminals where they'll learn even more terrible things about what they can do? What if we had a separate facility where they can get schooling, they can learn a trade, and when they come out, they might have a chance of being reintegrated into society. So from the start, from when the school opened in 1900, disturbing reports made their way out into the outside world. Students told of violent beatings. State investigators shared stories about their own grim findings, about unhealthy conditions, and periodically, reforms were enacted. The administration stopped leasing students to local businesses, for example, because sometimes the boys ended up dead. Corporal punishment and the use of dark cells, solitary confinement, was discontinued. They disassembled the sweat boxes, the iron cages where students were baked in the sun for attitude adjustment. They took those down. And they renamed the place a few times, as if a new brand might help. So the Florida Industrial School, with the next version, it became the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys. And always over time, the cruelty resumed. The dark cells reopened. A concrete utility shed called the White House became the new home of the spankings, where boys were whipped with a leather strap called Black Beauty. The students nicknamed the White House the ice cream factory because you came out with bruises of every color. So the boys continued to tell their stories of sexual abuse, torture, and homicide for decades and decades until state investigators finally closed the place in 2011. And I first heard of the school, Dozier School, in 2014 when the national media picked up the story. The state wanted to sell the land, and so they had to get rid of the bodies in the official graveyard and rebury them. And as they did so, they found another secret graveyard of unmarked graves, 55 people who were unidentified. And some of them had died of pneumonia. And then some of the bodies testified to horrific violence. There was blunt force trauma to skulls, shotgun pellets in rib cages. And, for decades, boys had disappeared, and their parents were told that they had run off, when in fact some of them were in the ground. So it was the summer of 2014, which was a very busy summer. It was a summer that Michael Brown, an unarmed teenager, was shot to death in Ferguson, Missouri, by white policemen. In New York, where I'm from, Eric Garner was choked to death on Staten Island by a white policeman. And with the rise of cell phone cameras, these everyday acts of violence against black people were being recorded. But the devices weren't, capturing a sudden spike in incidents. They merely recorded the standard level of brutality. We had the technology to see it nowadays through the cameras in our pockets, the things that happen every day. The same way a new telescope doesn't discover new stars, it just allows us, through this new technology, to capture what's around us every day. And despite evidence that's caught on camera, people are rarely ever held to account. With the Dozier School, students identified superintendents and guards who'd abused them, and nothing ever happened. A lot of people who worked there retired, got their pensions, got Citizen of the Year awards. Most of the kids who came forward in news reports about the Dozier School were white. But the majority of students there were actually African American. And I started to think about the black boys there and what a novel inspired by the students of Dozier might look like. When I first began writing 20 years ago, I sometimes get anxious about whether something I was putting down on the page might make sense to other people, a description of a place, an emotion, a way of looking at something. I'm such a weirdo, frankly, that it seemed unlikely that other people could relate what I'm trying to describe. And of course, that's a writer's job, to find the right words so that other people can see the world in the same way I do. And I started thinking that the world is pretty large, with 7 billion people. And if it's true for me, it's probably true for at least one other person. There's so many people. And if it's true for one other person, then maybe it's 100 people or 1,000 people. And if I find the right words, I can maybe make thousands and thousands of other people look at the world in the same way that I do. And that sort of took the pressure off. If I can just do my job right, then other people can relate to my distinct, idiosyncratic worldview. And it's also, as an aside, why I like coming to high schools, because I think there's always some weirdo in the audience who needs affirmation of their weirdo-ness. And if I can do that, I'm really happy. So the world is very large, but there's also a flip side. If something's happening in one place, it's probably happening in other places. And that I sort of started thinking about that, about the Dozier School. If there's one Dozier, how many other reform schools are there where the same thing is happening and no one is doing anything about it? Or maybe it's not a reform school, it's an orphanage. Once I started traveling with the book, The Nickel Boys, I would go to Ireland and meet people who would say, oh, this actually reminds me of this unwed home for mothers where people were getting put in the ground. Or in Canada, they had residential schools where Indigenous children were taken from their families to be tutored in white culture. And of course, when no one was looking, terrible things were happening. And just last summer, they found, again, as in Dozier, a lot of unmarked graves where people have been put in the ground. Or maybe it's not a reform school in Canada, but a for-profit incarceration camp on our southern border, for example, where refugee children sleep in cages. It's any place where a culture of impunity reigns and destroys and ruins. So that's the thing about numbers. They can calculate our common humanity, as I was saying before about writing, but also multiply our human weakness in terms of our brutality. So I was thinking about the Nickel Boys. I had a place, I needed characters. Sometimes a fragment of my personality makes its way into my characters or supporting characters, and sometimes not. Cora, the main character of the protagonist of the Underground Railroad, has the least amount of my personality in her, which is probably why it's my most popular book. I can't help but notice. But to create the two heroes for the Nickel Boys, I went a little closer to home. I borrowed from my own internal dilemma. It was 2017, and we just elected Donald Trump. And it seemed that it was a moment for me to consider, is the country going in the right direction, or are we regressing? The last 4 or 5 years have been a very difficult time, a time of great division in America. These divisions and disputes have always been with us, but sometimes they're more closer to the surface. The world can often be quite terrible. I'd like to think that the world is getting better for my children and the children they might have one day, the same way my parents and grandparents thought the world might be better for us, despite the discrimination and prejudice that they faced every day. They had to hope that me and my siblings would grow up in a better world. We make progress sometimes as a country, as a people, and then sometimes take 2 steps back. It's our depressing trend sometimes, and it starves the optimists among us while nourishing the pessimists. So I picked 2 protagonists who could speak to this division in me, these different parts of my personality, the hopeful one and then the more pessimistic one or realistic one. For Elwood in the Nickel Boys, one of the characters, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Provides a model of engagement in the world. If you stand up, fight for justice, you can remake the world. Turner, his opposite number in the Nickel Academy, has survived by seeing the world how it actually is, not how we want it to be. And so the staff and administration of the Nickel Academy become stand-ins for all the malevolent parts of the world, the forces that grind us down. And when Elwood and Turner meet in the novel, their debate about how to live and exist begins. And for me, that's the heart of the book, this philosophical debate between these 2 kids. So before I take questions for the audience, I just wanted to share a bit of the Nickel Boys with you. I think this section is pretty self-explanatory, so I'll just start. The boys rooted for Griff, even though he was a miserable bully who jimmied and pried at their weaknesses and made up weaknesses if he couldn't find any, such as calling you a knock-kneed piece of shit, even if your knees had never knocked your whole life. He tripped them and laughed at the ensuing pratfalls and slapped them around when he could get away with it. He punked them out, dragging them into dark rooms. He smelled like a horse and made fun of their mothers, which was pretty low given the general motherlessness of the student population. He stole their desserts on multiple occasions, swiped from trays with a grin, and even if the desserts in question were no great shakes, it was the principle. The boys rooted for Griff because he was going to represent the colored half of Nickel at the annual boxing match, and no matter what he did the rest of the year, the day of the fight, he would be all of them in one black body, and he was going to knock the white boy out. If Griff spat teeth before that happened, swell. The Nickel Academy was a reform school for boys, juvenile offenders, wards of the state, orphans, runaways who lit out to get away from mothers who entertained men for money, or to escape rummy fathers who came into their rooms in the middle of the night. Some of them had stolen money, cussed at their teachers, damaged public property. They told stories about bloody pool hall fights or uncles who sold moonshine. A bunch of them were sent there for offenses they never heard about. Malingering, mopery, incorrigibility. Words the boys didn't understand, but what was the point when their meaning was clear enough? Nickel. The combat served as a kind of mollifying spell to tide them through the daily humiliations. The colored boys had held the boxing title for 15 years, since 1949. Old hands on staff remembered the last white champion and still talked him up. Other things from the old days they talked about less often. Cherry Doc Burns had been an anvil-handed good old boy from a musty corner of Sewanee County who'd been sent to nickel for strangling a neighbor's chickens. 21 chickens, to be exact, because they were, quote, out to get him, unquote. Pain rolled off him like rain from a slate roof. After Doc Burns returned to the free world, the white boys who advanced to the final fight were pikers, so wobbly that over the years, tall tales about the former champion had grown more and more extravagant. Nature had gifted Doc Burns with unnaturally long reach, they said. His legendary combo had swatted down every comer and rattled windows. In fact, Doc Burns had been beaten and ill-treated by so many in his life, family and strangers alike, that by the time he arrived at Nickel, all punishments were gentle breezes. This was Griff's first term on the boxing team. He'd arrived at Nickel in February, right after the graduation of the previous champ, Axel Parks. His emergence as the baddest brother on campus had made him Axel's natural successor. Griff was a giant, broad-chested and hunched like a big brown bear. His daddy, it was said, was on a chain gang in Alabama for murdering his mother, making Griff's meanness a handed-down thing. Outside the ring, Griff made a hobby of terrorizing the weaker boys, the boys without friends, the weepy ones. Inside the ring, his prey stepped right up so he didn't have to waste time hunting. Like an electric toaster or an automated washing machine, boxing was a modern convenience that made his life easier. The coach for the colored team was a Mississippian named Max Davis, who worked in the school garage. He got an envelope at the end of the year for imparting what he learned during his welterweight stint. Max David made his pitch to Griff early in the summer. "My first fight made me cockeyed," he said, "and my farewell fight set my eyes right again. So trust me when I say this sport will break you down to make you better, and that's a fact." Griff smiled. He pulverized and unmanned his opponents with cruel inevitability through autumn. He was not graceful. He was not a scientist. He was a powerful instrument of violence, and that sufficed. Given the typical length of enrollment at Nickel, sabotage by staff aside, most students were only around for 1 or 2 fighting seasons. As the championship approached, the boys had to be schooled in the importance of those December matches. Prelims with the guys from your dorm, the match between your dorm's best guy and the best sluggers from the other 2 dorms, and then the bout between the best black fighter and whatever chump the white guys put up. The championship was their sole acquaintance with justice at Nickel. Trevor Nickel had instituted the championship matches in 1946, soon after he came on as the director for the Florida Industrial School for Boys, opened by the state in 1899. Nickel had never run a school before. His background was in agriculture. He made an impression at Klan meetings, however, with his impromptu speeches on the moral improvement of boys and the value of hard work, the disposition of young souls in need of care. The right people remembered his passion when an opening came up. His first Christmas at the school gave the county the chance to witness his improvements. Everything that needed a new coat of paint got a new coat of paint. The dark cells were briefly converted to more innocent use, and the regular beatings relocated to a white utility building nicknamed the White House. Had the good people of Eleanor, Florida, seen the industrial fan that was kept in the White House to mask the sound of the screams, they might have had a question or two, but the shed was not part of the tour. Nickel was a longtime boxing evangelist and had steered a lobbying group for its expansion in the Olympics. Boxing had always been popular at the school, but the new director took the sport's elevation as his remit. The athletic budget, long and easy target for directors on the skim, was rejiggered to pay for regulation equipment and to bolster the coaching staff. Nickel had maintained a general interest in fitness. He possessed a fervent belief in the miracle of a human specimen in top shape and often watched the boys shower to monitor the progress of their physical education. The director, Elwood had asked Turner when he told him about that last part. "Where do you think Dr. Campbell got his idea from?" Turner had said. Nickel was gone now, but Dr. Campbell, the school psychologist, was known to loiter at the white boys' showers to pick his dates. "All these dirty old men got a club together," Turner said. Thank you. I like to start off light and then descent into terror and horror. Usually works for me. But yeah, if you have questions, I'd love to answer them about anything, about the work, about writing. Who's going to win the Preakness next year? Or is that a horse thing? I don't even know. But if there's a microphone in the front there.
Thank you for being here. I'm really interested in genealogy and going back in my family. I've seen a lot of writers, people who wanted to be writers. Have you gone into your genealogy? Do you have anybody in your family that influenced you? And if you didn't, who are your main influences on your writing?
Sure. Maybe the next question will go to the microphone, and I'll repeat what she just asked. Interest in genealogy. Have I done any looking into my own family's history? Anyone inspired me from my family to be a writer? No, my parents didn't want me to be a writer. They want me to get a real job. I like to support myself. And actually, I don't really support my children going into the arts. It's sort of a depressing business. And my son, for example, is named Beckett. And we named him Beckett after the famous depressive writer. Because, if you know that song, A Boy Named Sue, we thought if we named him Beckett, he'd become like this happy-go-lucky jock or investment banker or something and make a living. So far, he's, hasn't worked out, unfortunately. Genealogy, my mother's side is very well documented, going back to Virginia in the late 1800s. The first person in that line of the family was a biracial woman from Ireland who was shipped over by the Episcopal Church and became an indentured servant for 10 years and then was free and started a big brood of preachers and teachers in Virginia. My father's side is from Georgia and Florida, sort of sketchy. He wasn't really in touch with them. But when the Underground Railroad came out, I would say so many of my ancestors were lost in the void of slavery, and then I got angry calls from uncles who were like, "Don't you know that blah, 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 Virginia," and stuff like that. So I didn't know much before, but then since then I've been schooled in these different parts of my family. So thank you. And maybe, if you have the microphone, if you want to pick people, because I can't really see because of the lights.
Colson?
Oh, we're even here.
Yeah, you've got your student essay winners to ask questions.
Excellent.
Hello, my name is Ya Santua Tafarai. I am homeschooled and in grade 11. And my question for you is, how did you research for Harlem Shuffle?
Research Harlem Shuffle. So I've written 3 sort of historical novels in a row, and really primary sources are the greatest sort of gift to me, whether I was reading slave narratives or interviews with former slaves. I would go through them and pick up the language, the slang, how they referred to what they ate and their clothes, and I would use that to furnish the Underground Railroad and make it seem realistic, maybe not to someone in 1850, but to a modern person. And the same thing with the Nickel Boys. There's journalism done over the decades about the school. The survivors have a website where they tell their stories about being at the Nickel Academy. And there's stuff like the White House. I couldn't come up with that detail. That's how they actually referred to the place where they got beaten. And so I would take slang, and slang hopefully makes the book sound or seem realistic. And with the Harlem Shuffle, it was the same thing. If you go to YouTube and put in 1960s Harlem. There's some guy who was walking down the street and filmed 125th Street in 1962, and then his grandson or granddaughter is uploaded to YouTube. And so I watch this footage and say, oh, okay, so a pork chop sandwich was 25 cents. I read memoirs of gangsters and hustlers. William Burroughs, avant-garde writer from the 50s and 60s, part of the beatniks, Beat Generation, was a scam artist and junkie in New York in the 40s and 50s. And he writes about all his scams and scoring drugs, and it's just a great resource for period slang. Mobsters have memoirs, and that's how I learned about how numbers rackets work. It's a great education and criminal enterprise, reading how people describe how they do things. Some of it stayed with me. I'm not like a heister, but definitely when I'm on the highway, I'm often like, oh, I'd dump a body there, no problem. You know, we're in between exits. You just get off the exit, double back, you know, and come back on in 5 minutes. And then also the New York Times. You know, the Harlem Shuffle takes place in 59, 61, and 64. So I'll just go scan the front page of the New York Times. What can I use from what was happening in the city this year to serve the main character, Ray Carney's story? Robert Wagner running for re-election in 61, that becomes a subplot in the novel. In 1964, there was a race riot when a white policeman killed a young black teenager. How can that become the backdrop and illustrate the progress or lack of progress we're making in civil rights? So primary sources, really great. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were going to ask me questions. I would have directed my attention to you before.
Oh, no, you're fine. Thank you again.
Sure.
My name is Elizabeth Knight. I am homeschooled and I am 11th grade. So I wanted to ask, what are some other genres or time periods that I haven't written about yet that you would like to explore in the future?
Sure, no, thanks. Yeah, you know, like everyone else, I like different kinds of stories. And so I like fantasy, I like realism. Underground Railroad has a fantastic element, or else I couldn't have had that sort of conversation with history. And Nickel Boys is realistic. I have a zombie novel, Zone 1, as I mentioned. This is a crime novel, Harlem Shuffle. So things I have not written, my friend's a big foodie, and he's like, oh, we should do a cookbook together. But he doesn't really cook. I think I'd be doing all the heavy lifting. So that, you know, I'm not sure about that one. And I think you never really know. You know, I think I didn't wake up July 5th, 2009, thinking I'm going to write a zombie novel. The next day I had a dream. I do get my ideas from any old place, and if they argue for themselves by staying with me, they're arguing for their viability as a project. And so it took 14 years for me to do Underground Railroad, but the idea stayed with me. I didn't know I'd write a crime novel until I was driving with my wife and thinking about what movie should I rent that night. And I was like, Ocean's 11, again, I do like it. They must have had so much fun. Like, what if I wrote a heist novel? So there's nothing I've ruled out. And you never know, so it's sort of the point of the first part. You never know where your ideas are going to come from, watching TV or reading a magazine or anywhere. So thanks a lot, Elizabeth.
All right, thank you.
My name is Kendall Robertson. I'm a senior here at MLK High School, and I actually have 2 questions for you. So when you begin writing a novel, do you know how it's going to end?
Yes. Some people are like, I sit down at my desk and the muse sort of wafts through the window, like fly, and the day inspiration just takes me. I live in New York. The muse is coming down on a 7 train. There's a trash fire. Can't get to my house. So I have to have an outline. And so I know the beginning and the end, definitely. And for the last couple of books, I've always known like the last image, sometimes the last sentence of the book before I start writing. So I know the destination. Some things I don't know, like say in the Nickel Boys, I don't know the names of Griff, the antagonist, in the middle section. I know that I'm going to use the boxing match at the school, but I don't know the personalities of the fighters. I know the outcome. And I think if you overplan, it sort of kills the idea. But I know the beginning and the end. I don't know the names or how people walk and talk. I know what they have to do. And then as I approach their first appearance, I start figuring out, okay, Griff has this backstory, and he's going to have this journey in this chapter. And this is how he talks. So know the destination, definitely, but you have to leave room for surprise, for characters who you think are maybe minor become bigger because they end up being fun to write or play a bigger role.
My next question is, if there are any inspiring novelists in the audience, what's the best advice that you could give them?
Sure. Advice for aspiring novelists. So, well, if you want to write, you're gonna have to read a lot. So if there's somebody who you read who clicks with you, read a lot of stuff by them. Why do they appeal to you? What are they doing? What can you figure out about their method that's inspiring? So read and read and read to figure out what kind of writer you want to be, and then write and write and write to find out what kind of writer you actually are. So you can only become good by failing and screwing up a lot, and then you hopefully learn from your mistakes. So I assume if you want to be a writer, you like reading, so that's a big part of it. And then you're just going to have to suck and then get better, and then have a relapse and suck some more and then get better. And that's like most things in life. The more you do it, the better you get at it, hopefully.
Thank you.
Sure.